Okay. Ready to go.
Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Resilience for the Urban Poor Forum 2021. My name is Sugar Gonzalez and I'm from the Asian Development Bank's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. In line with the forum's overall objective, we are excited to introduce to you ADB's new initiative, the Community Resilience Partnership Program, or the CRPP. The CRPP was also launched at the recently concluded United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP26, held in Glasgow as a side event. CRPP partners, which include Nordic Development Fund, UK, AFD, International Institute for Environment and Development, and Wire Commission were all present in this important event. For this session, we will have two parts. The first part will provide you overview of the CRPP and the gender window, while the second part will be a moderated discussion which aims to capture ideas and suggestions on how to better operationalize the CRPP gender window and to identify good practices from the region on women being agents of change of resilience building. So for some housekeeping rules, on your screen on the upper right side, you can see the Q&A box, chat box, feedback tab, and poll question tab. Later, we will have poll questions and we encourage you to participate. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box. While during the moderated discussion, we request you to join and participate in the conversation and share any of your ideas regarding the topic. You can raise your hand, turn on your camera and microphone to acknowledge you, or you can also post your ideas using the chat box. Also, please note that this session is being recorded. So maybe we can proceed and let's start with the first poll question. Okay, I'm not seeing the poll question now. If you can share the screen. Okay. So what I'm seeing now is, all right. So for the first poll question, what type of organization do you represent? Okay, what I can see is here, majority of our participants are coming from the civil society organization, while others, followed by others, and followed by financing institution. Okay, so maybe let's proceed with the next poll question. For our second question, what do you think is the most important aspect to consider to ensure gender is integrated in project designs that aim to build resilience to climate risk in urban contexts? Could it be assessment of gender differentiated climate change risks, promotion of women's meaningful participation, identification and implementation of gender transformative approaches, or promotion of transformative M&E plans? And if you choose others, please indicate it in the chat box. Okay, so what I can see is that, yeah, responses are still coming in. All right. So I think majority of the participants have indicated that it is important to have meaningful participation among women. We need to promote their participation. And this is followed by, identification and implementation of gender transformative approaches. Okay, thank you. Later on during the moderated discussion, we can discuss this more in detail, and probably you can share more ideas on this. So at this moment, maybe we can have the CRPP video shared to the participants. This is the video that we prepared, which provides an overview of the CRPP.
Sorry, we'll add that one on there shortly.
All right, I can share it if you're having difficulty.
There we go.
Okay.
Excellent. Is that coming through?
Yes.
The Asia and Pacific region is experiencing a sharp increase in climate shocks and stresses. Floods, droughts, cyclones, and heat stress are already impacting the livelihoods, health, food, and water security of millions of people, especially vulnerable women and men below and near the poverty line. Moreover, the adverse impacts of climate change are largely felt at the local level due to socioeconomic and environmental factors. Hence, there is an urgent need for pro-poor climate adaptation solutions that can be delivered at scale and tailored to local contexts. However, limited climate adaptation finance is reaching the local level to respond to the needs of the vulnerable women and men. It is in this context that the Community Resilience Partnership Program, or CRPP, has been designed by the Asian Development Bank in partnership with WIRO Commission and the International Institute for Environment and Development to support governments and communities in Asia and the Pacific region to scale up pro-poor resilience investments, especially at the community level. A key focus of the CRPP is to strengthen local institutions to enable them to mainstream adaptation and improve governance, empowering poor women and men to participate in decision-making processes in line with the locally led principles of the Global Commission on Adaptation. Through such an approach, the CRPP aims to facilitate channeling of climate finance to the local level, thereby ensuring its responsiveness to the priorities of the poorest. Established in 2021, the CRPP will be implemented over a period of 10 years, providing a long-term commitment for building resilience of poor and vulnerable people to the impacts of climate change. It will be operationalized through the Community Resilience Financing Partnership Facility. The facility will include a trust fund to be administered by ADB, which will provide technical assistance and grant resources to participating countries for knowledge and action research, preparation of large-scale bankable adaptation investments, and capacity building for local governments, communities, and institutions, and for testing innovative approaches through pilots. In addition to ensuring that all activities appropriately mainstream gender, the trust fund includes a dedicated gender window with funds earmarked specifically for supporting women-focused investments. Recognizing that adaptation needs are context-specific, implementation of the CRPP will be led by the participating countries' governments in close partnership with communities. The CRPP will be implemented in close collaboration with ongoing global, regional, and national programs on resilience and financial institutions, including global climate funds. Join the CRPP to support investments in climate resilience that reach scale while ensuring no one is left behind.
Okay, thank you. At this point, I'll be sharing with you the PowerPoint presentation. All right, I hope, are you seeing my PowerPoint presentation? No. Okay, there.
Yep.
Okay, to give you more in-depth background on what CRPP is, let me present you its general framework and how it aims to address the challenges brought by climate change to the local communities with emphasis on the urban poor. As we all know, the poor and vulnerable communities, including the urban poor, suffer disproportionately due to their significant exposure and vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. In urban areas, many poor households living in slum areas are without or have limited access to basic services and infrastructure. And most of the time, they have this substandard housing. They are highly dependent on degrading natural resources, rely on informal economy, and often left out when formal decisions are made, especially among women. Due to their limited access to resources such as land, assets, and skills, they have limited or even lack adaptive capacity, which led them to use maladaptive and unsustainable practices, further pushing them to poverty. It is in this context that fundamental transformational changes are needed to redirect the lives and livelihoods of these poor and vulnerable people toward a more climate resilient and sustainable future. Through the implementation of the CRPP, it will help scale up climate adaptation investments, especially at the community level, that explicitly address the nexus between climate change, poverty, and gender. The CRPP will contribute to transformational change through these key objectives by mobilizing large-scale public investments that support community-level adaptation of poor and vulnerable people. And an example of this could be upgrading of urban informal settlements, supporting adaptive social protection program, or through introduction of vocational training related on resilience. Second, developing national and local policies, plans, and programs that promote financing for community-led adaptation. And this could be possibly through community-driven approaches as reflected in the country's national adaptation plans. And third is to increase the meaningful participation of poor women and men in resilience-related decision-making. So, how will the CRPP provide support? As mentioned in the video that we shared earlier, the CRPP will be operationalized through the Community Resilience Financing Partnership Facility, which will be implemented for 10 years, providing long-term commitment for building resilience. It will include multi-donor trust fund administered by ADB, and which will provide grant and technical assistance resources to support research and analysis for identifying transformational adaptation investments that meet community needs and are aligned with national and local climate and poverty reduction priorities. It will support building capacity of national and local institutions for pursuing climate risk-informed poverty reduction strategies and programs in non-infrastructure sectors such as education, health, social protection, financial inclusion, and livelihood-related sectors. It will also help increase awareness, and this can be through policy dialogues and documenting and sharing lessons, including those lessons emerging from the COVID-19 response, which are critical in building future resilience. As well as it will also support governments in the preparation of large-scale investment projects and support pilots and small grants to demonstrate innovative concepts and approaches for delivering transformational adaptation solutions at the community level. So at this juncture, let me stop here and then transfer it over to Alex to explain more on the gender window of the CRPP. Alex Fowler is our resilience specialist who is helping us in developing and implementing this CRPP. Over to you, Alex.
Okay, thank you so much, Sugar. So as we can see on this slide, the CRPP funding architecture includes the gender window as part of the trust fund. So the gender window is essentially trust fund resources that are earmarked specifically for investing in women-centered adaptation initiatives that build the resilience of women to climate change. So as part of the trust fund, it will support the same types of actions that Sugar's just mentioned, but with a particular focus on women, and use the inclusive processes where women are engaged at all levels of decision making. It's important to know, it's key to know actually, that the gender window goes beyond mainstreaming gender considerations to the program. It's specific dedicated resources for strengthening women's adaptive capacity and challenging the structural, social, cultural norms that drive their vulnerability. Okay, Sugar, go to the next slide, thank you. Okay, so this slide's we're going to talk a little bit about why the gender window has been a key part in the development of the CRPP. And there are really three key issues that has brought about the development of this gender window. So firstly, the recognition that women have a disproportionate levels of vulnerability compared to men, and as such are impacted differently by climate change. So women in Asia account for over 2/3 of all people living on less than $2 a day. And in informal settlements, for example, women are often overrepresented in urban areas and informal settlements, particularly among certain age groups. As Sugar said, women don't always have the same rights as men to land and housing. Women don't have the same sort of access to financial services, technology, information and early warning systems. And crucially, they're often held back from fully participating in their community and informal decision-making processes. So these factors arise from deeply entrenched social and political inequalities and patriarchal power structures, and they limit women's leadership and participation in decision-making, which in turn contributes to low adaptive capacity and high levels of vulnerability. And obviously this is particularly the case in poor communities, such as in informal settlements in urban areas. So another factor is that despite this disproportionate vulnerability, we recognize that women have a critical role to play in advancing investment in building resilience to climate change, particularly at the local level. Obviously, women's unique knowledge and skills and perspectives means that they are vital drivers of resilient development and must be recognized as such. Women have a leadership role to play in identifying, designing, and implementing adaptation measures effectively and efficiently. But despite the recognition of these two factors that I've just mentioned, existing national policies and plans, as well as sectoral policies and plans and processes, they do not consider women's role in resilience building an explicit priority, which inhibits investment in building women's resilience, and therefore there's a clear need for investment or scaling up investment in this regard. Can you go to the next slide, Sugar? Okay. So the CRP's approach to implementing investment activities through the gender window will emphasize women's role in resilience as active stakeholders and agents of change, not just focusing on the vulnerability factors and viewing women as victims. So through knowledge and support technical assistance, the gender window will support carrying out research and knowledge generation to build an evidence base for value investing in women-focused adaptation measures. This will include implementing pilot projects on a small scale. Policy dialogues and forums will be critical to creating in-country partnerships between stakeholders, both vertically from local level up to national level, and horizontally between community-based organizations and local governments, for example. And this will really be critical part of breaking down existing barriers to women's participation in adaptation and decision-making. Support will be provided for improving policy frameworks to facilitate investment in women-focused adaptation and stimulate coherence and convergence across gender, climate change, and other key sectors such as agriculture, land use planning, and urban planning. And the key objective of this technical assistance work is to generate the political will, capacity, and commitment from governments and communities to mobilize investment in women-focused adaptation. that help tackle climate change. Okay, next slide, please, Sugar. Okay, and so technical assistance will also be provided for the gender to support preparation of large-scale investment projects that include measures that explicitly strengthen resilience of women. And in this way, adaptation measures can be delivered as part of large-scale government poverty reduction programs. And this is an innovative part of the CRPP model or structure. And it's a way of mobilizing resources on a large enough scale to really catalyze transformative change, which is at the heart of the CRPP. So some examples might include in informal settlement upgrading programs, including specific measures for reducing heat in households to protect women against extreme heat events, as extreme heat events are projected to rise in many cities in Asian Pacific region, with women having a heavy burden on household care and spending potentially more time in houses than men. This would be a particularly targeted area which could be supported. Another example could be adaptive social protection mechanisms that might release payments to street vendors when income is lost through disruption of floods or extreme heat. Okay, and during the project preparation, it will be critical to use gender disaggregated climate information and data to really understand what the differentiated vulnerability characteristics are within different contexts. Include outputs that address structural inequalities between men and women. So ensuring participation of women in decision-making, information channels that are tailored to women's specific needs and contexts would be key. Also ensuring sustainable outcomes by strengthening capacity and leadership skills of women. And also monitoring evaluation provides an opportunity to become part of the process of increasing women's agency. They can be, these types of monitoring processes can be consciously designed to increase women's capacity to assess the efficiency and effectiveness of adaptation measures and crucially institutionalizing learning. Okay, next slide. Okay, and finally, grant resources will be provided for the implementation of the types of measures that are discussed in the last slide, for explicitly building resilience of women as part of the large-scale poverty reduction programs that are prepared in the previous activity that I mentioned. So it might be, for example, kitchen gardens as part of informal settlement upgrading programs or livelihood development programs. And these initiatives will be community-based and led by women. Okay, final slide. Okay, so just to sum up, the CRPP gender window will support the identification, development, and preparation of women-focused investments in climate resilience that promote a positive change towards gender equality and challenge historical patriarchal norms and practices. The CRPP is a partnership program, and key partners, funding partners, for example, include the UK Aid, NDF, also the French Development Agency, and implementing partners, the Huayru Commission and the International Institute for Environment and Development. Okay, so with that, we'd like to open up the forum now and really take this opportunity to hear from you, the participants, about how this gender window can be operationalized within the context of urban spaces, and particularly the urban port. And yeah, we hope for some interesting discussions on the approaches that should be taken, some examples from the region that are relevant to the gender window. Perhaps a place to start would be just to see if there are any reflections from participants. or any clarifications about the gender window. I think, am I right, Sugar, that people can raise their hand and or write in the chat as well on the platform?
Yes, you're correct, Alex. And maybe, Alex, you can turn on your camera, if that's okay.
Ah, sorry, I thought I had it turned on. Sorry, apologies. I thought
Now they can see you.
Sorry. Okay, let's see. Click on the platform. Okay, so we've got a question here. Can we use the CRPP gender window to top up on existing grants or to explore additional activities focused on women and girls? Yeah, the key here, I think, is to make sure there is that explicit focus on building the resilience of women and girls. As we mentioned, they will be part of ongoing, they can be part of ongoing poverty reduction programs and large-scale investments. And I think there is an opportunity to complement some existing initiatives with some of the funds from the gender window. I will ask you to jump in if there's anything that on the mechanics of the gender window and the specific utilities of it. Just jump in. Okay, and what are the different areas of capacity building that CRPP is looking at? So the CRPP will be focusing on building capacity on as much as with governments, within governments and communities. So for example, building institutional capacity will be looking at how to use specific tools, creating policy frameworks and creating frameworks and processes, for example, to increase participation and in this case, in the gender window, specific participation of women within decision-making processes on adaptation. So there's that institutional side, and also building capacity of community-based organizations, their leadership capacity, knowledge, strengthening knowledge, so that they have the tools to participate effectively in the forums, institutional forums. Okay, any other questions? Any other questions on any other reflections on the gender window? If not, then perhaps we can go to open this up. We can go to a question on a more specific question on how do we any reflections on how are there any specific measures or interventions or approaches, implementation ideas that should be considered while designing programs under the gender window, with a particular focus on the urban context? Anybody want to come in? What is going to be key to operationalizing the gender window in the urban context? So, for example, we identified that the promotion of women's meaningful participation is key. Do we have any suggestions on how that can be achieved within informal settlements, for example? How can we increase women's participation in adaptation decision-making to improve informal settlements?
Alex, we have a representative from Wire Commission here, Mr. Ranjana. Maybe Mr. Ranjana can provide some of reflections on your question.
Hi, thanks for the question, Alex. I think at this point, I just mentioned two very basic things that would make a difference to the way in which the gender window actually enhances meaningful participation. I mean, it's great to see that it's the gender window actually very specifically and explicitly targets women. One is, I think you have to work with organized women's groups. If it's, if you're looking at urban areas, then organized women's groups in urban areas who have a history and track record of problem solving, even if that problem solving is not around resilience building. We know that the everyday problems that communities and women's groups particularly face in urban informal settlements has a lot to do with managing different kinds of crises. We know that they live with a sort of basket of risks and vulnerabilities, and they have to continually trade off among these in order to survive every day. So I think working with these groups to design and develop programs, the ways in which money is going to flow, allowing them to identify priorities and building their capacity to design as you move forward, and having multiple iterations of dialogue through which grassroots women can engage with other institutions, I think is a very important part of meaningfully engaging these groups who have been solving problems for a long time, but whose engagement tends to be excluded ultimately when programs and projects are designed, because they're outside public decision making usually. So let me just put that out there.
Thank you so much, Sanjana.
Sorry,
Sorry,
if I can,
Danny. Yes,
yeah.
please.
Yeah, if I can just add to this, from an ADB perspective, I think that we are already doing some things as we're designing projects where we are involving women and seeking women's views in terms of project designs and gap design and so on. I think what something like this gender window allows us to do, and maybe challenges us to do, is to look at what else we could be doing in that process. So for example, and I think that there's always sort of, having been involved in the due diligence process around different projects, I know, and I have been part of consulting with women, but I think this in project design and so on, and as the project gets implemented. But I think the challenge is to look at sort of what kinds of things can we do more of to meaningfully engage women, given that we have additional resources provided through this gender window. So, and I think, often when we talk about women's engagement, we look at it as something like, we will invite these community women and they will come. And I think that is sometimes problematic because it does not really acknowledge sort of women's sort of multiple responsibilities, and it takes women's time. Most women in these communities from vulnerable populations, are already time poor. They face a huge pressure from time poverty. So what kinds of things can we do, with these resources to address some of these, and not expect that women's time is like nature, the way that we've treated nature, this endless resource that we can continue tapping, on, but actually look at it differently. So let me just give you a very concrete example. I think often there's this assumption that women will automatically want to and be able to take on a role in community organizers in emergency awareness, providing sort of mobilizing the community and providing information and so on. why could we not treat that as a source of employment for women and for women to be generated for that work? Why do we continue to see it as something where women will, volunteer whatever little time they have left during the day to do this? So it is about maybe valuing women's time differently as we're engaging them in the design of projects. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Suranjana and Zoni. Don't know if anyone has any direct responses to those points.
Can I respond?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so I think it's fantastic what Zoni just brought up, this idea of expecting women to volunteer their time, to fulfill various functions. And we find that, basically what it does is it acknowledges that there's something of value to offer, but when that doesn't, their time and their contributions are not formally recognized, remunerated, or resourced, I think that is problematic. So I think one of the things we have to look at in terms of design is to look at how do you recognize and invest in grassroots women's leadership roles. So there are public leadership roles, whether it's in disseminating information or in negotiating for resources for their communities, are things that visibly start to shift their equation with other actors in the communities and start to challenge the norms around what is grassroots women's role and contribution to bringing about transformative change. And if we can, in designing these programs and processes, if we can concretely identify leadership roles which we assign to grassroots women, and then make an investment in strengthening their ability to play those roles, remunerating or resourcing them in whatever way we need to ensure that they are available and we're actually compensating for their contributions there. I think that would be a very, very valuable contribution that we can make to developing grassroots women's meaningful engagement in designing a more gender equitable, and empowering process.
Great. Thanks, Suranjana. Does anybody have any other responses to that? Okay, just to I think there's some really some interesting points from you both. I think particularly looking at so we mentioned before the CRPP has some one of the functions of the CRPP is to support research and knowledge generation in all matters to do with building resilience and effective approaches to building resilience. And so part of that could be commissioning studies to look at how we overcome some of those barriers in terms of women's participation in adaptation decision making. So, for example, the time poverty aspect that Zoni mentioned. What are these barriers and how can they be overcome in order to generate meaningful participation and to really maximize those skills. Suranjana mentioned that community-based women's organizations already have a lot of women's organizations have a lot of problem-solving skills. They have a lot of experience in this area. How can we effectively channel that towards resilience building and adaptation decision making? And so generating that evidence will be an important part, I think, of the CRPP's support. Okay, maybe we can quickly go to, yes, go ahead, please, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the areas is sort of going back to the knowledge that exists among women in the communities. I think maybe one contribution that this could make is really to look that the CRPP could make is helping to document and also share the traditional knowledge that already exists among women around resilience related issues, whether it's in terms of agriculture. We know that women have great knowledge that is often not valued around seeds and crops and management of natural resources. So I think documenting those is really important. There's also a lot of knowledge around the uses of different plants and which is really important in terms of biodiversity conservation. So I think that in terms of the knowledge that we're talking about generating, we should also look at knowledge that already exists and is very much part of women working at the community level and how they use natural resources. And finally, I think, we always come across this issue of, do we have enough data about this, X, Y, and Z before, or gender equality, or how, how this going in this direction, does it really make sense? And I think it's really important that we have good data to inform how we develop our projects. But I don't think that, we're facing a climate crisis. I don't think we can wait until we have all of the data before we start moving forward. And I think we have enough data about why it makes sense to invest in women, why we need to invest at the community level, how women have a very close connection to natural resource management, and how we should value and strengthen that and recognize that. And so I think this is a really good moment for us to move forward with the knowledge that we have, perhaps documenting some good practices that already exist, and looking at how we can share the evidence that we find through the experience of the CRPP with other DMCs and other communities. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tony. I think that's an important point. Yeah, that it's not just about generating new knowledge, it's about using what is there and to scale up. That's one of the key parts of CRPP, would be scaling up interventions at either a national level or a regional level. And I think the value of a regional project like the CRPP, the regional program, sorry, is that we can transfer some of that existing knowledge, document it, as you say, and see about how any specific adaptation approaches or practices can be scaled up, whether nationally or throughout the region. So yeah, thank you for that. Okay, on that note, does anybody have any participants who'd like to invite participants to share any experiences in that way, like any practice that they've come across in their day-to-day that where women are strength and resilience within their communities that could be scaled up? Is there possibilities or activities that could be scaled up to different cities within the country or in the region? Does anybody want to come in?
So I can give a couple of examples from our work, unless do you have anybody on the chat who wants to come in?
I can't see. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I can't see any hands raised.
Again, yeah, I appreciate what Zoni said about using existing knowledge as well as generating new knowledge. I think that this CRPP is a new and innovative program, and And I think that there's a lot of scope to learn as we do things together. So I think that, you had a point about using gender disaggregated climate information. That information, as far as I know, doesn't really exist. So we are going to figure out how climate information actually speaks to women in poor communities. That's one step. And then what are the differential impacts on different groups within these communities? How does it, how are women's groups affected? How are different livelihoods groups affected? And, different people of different ages, and there are different issues around health or transport or and so on affected. So I think one is that we're going to together generate that knowledge, and that's going to require a lot of collaboration and experimentation and action learning and action research. I think the other piece is that there is tremendous power in putting information in the hands of grassroots women. So we've seen, for example, when they conduct their own surveys. So women's groups in our network have surveyed households to find out how much food they're eating. And then they discovered that, households have considerably reduced the amount of food that they are able to buy for various reasons, including climate change, other kinds of economic problems. So there is a big difference between giving them information and them gathering and analyzing that information themselves and owning it and developing solutions in response to that. So I think that putting or ensuring that knowledge and information that is generated by local women's groups is used by them and then is used as part of building the evidence base that can be presented to external audiences is very important. So for example, in the urban areas, you have the slum dwellers networks, which are, have as one of their basic organizing tools use the idea of enumerating their settlements. So they find out how many people live in their settlements, and they know about each and every household and what kinds of infrastructure and resources that settlement has access to. And often the kind of knowledge that grassroots groups are generating, whether it's in urban or rural areas, is looking at the informal sector. They're looking at informal livelihoods, informal settlements, and the government doesn't have data on these groups. And so this kind of real-time updated data of those who are often excluded from government databases makes a big difference, and not only empowers groups themselves, but this gives them a very powerful negotiating tool which they can take to governments and show ways in which they can contribute to making government programs more effective. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Suranjana. Yeah, so really building on or making the most of the skills that are at the community level and transferring that up and into higher decision making levels. Yeah, I think that's an important point. Thank you. Perhaps we've got about 10 minutes left. Perhaps we could go back. I'll just go back to the to some of the questions that are coming in and do my best to answer some of them. So, for example, it's a question: will the gender window specifically target poor women or women in general? So, as the CRPP has a focus on poor communities, then the gender window will be focusing on building resilience of particularly poor women within poor communities. So yeah, says that. Does the gender window only focus on women, or does it include LGBTQ groups? So the gender window is generally a focus on women and girls, but the CRPP in general will focus on vulnerable groups and all vulnerable groups within poor communities. The gender window, we're focusing principally on building the resilience of women and girls. Okay, I'm not sure if this question might have been answered already. How do we ensure the meaningful participation of women if they have to balance between productive economic related activities and reproductive household level activities? I think that was maybe potentially answered before by Zoni and Suranjana, talking about the time poverty and that being a particular barrier to including women in participation in decision-making activities. So it's about exploring those barriers and how to overcome them. And then last one, perhaps maybe I can open this up to Suranjana and Zoni. How to encourage non-structural measures. I'm not quite sure what that means. So informal measures, I guess, towards building resilience and increasing participation.
No, non-structural actually refers to sort of not physical infrastructure and housing,
Okay, yeah.
types of things, but the more power, we would call them social and political power-related processes, which are vital to the processes of building resilience. You know, so the question is how to encourage. Is that what it is? I think
yes, yeah.
So I think that the CRPP and the gender window particularly have to incentivize the collective leadership processes. I know that I think it's a hard thing for banks to do to recognize and to resource the collective organizing. But at the same time, we know that this is a very, very vital, important foundational process for women, because as individuals, they're not able to negotiate and challenge existing norms and structures. So we really have to support in whatever way and invest in strengthening grassroots women's organizations and collective leadership. So I think that's one way. The other thing that's very important is keep them, ensure that there are incentives for governing institutions, whether at local or national level, to engage and partner with grassroots organizations. And I think that can be a very challenging and long drawn out process, because that won't happen in a short 1 year or maybe even 2 or 3 year project time frame. That takes a long time to build the relationships, the trust, to actually create opportunities to collaborate, so that partners begin to see where different partner strengths and capacities create synergies. So I think that these could be two areas in which you invest in non-structural areas. The other, which is very sort of more technical, could be the area of getting climate scientific information available to communities in a more user-friendly, practical way, which help communities to plan and put, and women's groups particularly, to put a climate resilience lens on all the development that's occurring around them. Thanks.
3 minutes remaining.
Okay, thank you for that, Suranjana. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Could I just add sort of one very brief point to this? And I think, it's also quite important that we find ways to also look at and work on addressing gender and social norms that are preventing women from fully participating at the community level, that are preventing them from entering into jobs that are traditionally not held by women, or access to economic resources. So I think that, for gender equality work has to be intentional, and it has to intentionally try to address social and gender norms. So this, I think, will need to be part of sort of the the added value that maybe the resources and the gender fund can bring and can take on is investing also in addressing existing and persistent gender norms.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So we've got 2 minutes left. I'd potentially like to pass over to Mr. Augustino Roy, who's the Principal Climate Change Specialist at ADB, to maybe offer a summary of some of the discussions and to close the meeting. Is that okay?
Thanks, Alex. I will dare not summarize a discussion in 2 minutes. But, I will just try to synthesize what I understood from my point of view is important. I think the ask from the gender window is quite tall, right? Because we really want to show to the gender window that if we want to move away from the notion of women being passive beneficiaries and vulnerable population to women being agents of change, where you start recognizing women as experts, as resources, which automatically means that women need to be remunerated for those resources, needs to find jobs in the work that resilience discussion entails, etc. So that's a big shift actually we're looking at. In order to do that, I take away 3 key directions which perhaps the gender window could aim to work towards. One is to the whole issue around recognizing the knowledge that is present within women and women's group, document the knowledge, build the evidence, and then try to use the evidence to influence policies and programs where required. So there's a whole knowledge, information, action research piece, which is important for the gender window to focus on. And that piece should very much involve the women itself. So it's not about having external people document the work only, it's including the women in that work. That's the first piece. Second, I think, which is absolutely critical and perhaps very, very tough, is to see how the gender window can see softer issues as an investment itself, which means over here what Zoni and Suranjana talked about, addressing the gender and social norms. How do you see the existing organized women's group? How do you build their negotiation capacity to interact with local governments and influence national government programs? And how do you incentivize this collective organization process? A lot of softer issues, but these are extremely challenging because it kind of interacts with your existing social norms. I think that's a big area of task of the window itself. And the third area is, I would say, responding to women's resilience needs. In this case, women should have access to information, but also the capacity to understand and interpret climate information for their decision-making purposes. Or women might need capacity building. We have a young guest over here. Hello. We have certain new skills building required for women to diversify their livelihoods, or to engage in infrastructure, infrastructure projects, in maintenance of projects. But a lot of skills, capacity, informational needs that are directly responding to women's needs. So for me, these 3 parts: one is this evidence piece of action research. Second is the most softer negotiation issues, which relates to social and gender norms. And the third is directly responding to the needs of the women's to help them build resilience. So I think that's my takeaway. I'm very happy that we had the discussion right at the beginning when the program is just launched. And we look forward to continue interacting with all of you over the course of the period. So feel free to reach out to us if you have any suggestions on how the gender window can be operationalized. And hopefully we can partner with all of you as we move towards implementation. I'll stop over here, hand it back to Sugar and Alex. Thank you.
Thanks, Argo. And we've come to the end of the session, and it's 2 minutes past our schedule. So it was a wonderful and a very fruitful discussion, and I hope everyone learns from this clinic. For us in the CRPP team, ADB team, this has been a very useful discussion as we further develop and improve our the gender window of the CRPP as we implement them. So towards this end, I would like to thank everyone who joined this session, especially to Saranjana and Zoni for their very helpful and useful suggestions and ideas that they shared with us. So thank you again, and hope to see you in the next session tomorrow's session of this resilience for the Urban Poor Seminar Forum. Thank you.